President Trump's pick, that's Congressman Randy Feenstra, conceded in the Iowa's Republican primary for governor. I wonder if that means the Trump endorsement is weakening somewhat in Iowa. And update us on the race for governor.
Well, this is exactly what we were getting into yesterday, Errol, and look at how it all played out. This was a rare loss for a President Trump-endorsed candidate in a very red state, but loss nonetheless. So, Feenstra lost to Zach Lane. Let's talk a little bit about what put him ahead.
Something is shifting in Iowa right now, and almost nobody in the national media seems ready to admit how serious it is. But trust me, if you look away, you may miss one of the most stunning Republican breakdowns of this political era happening right in front of us. We are not talking about some unpredictable purple battleground where wild election results happen every cycle. This is Iowa, deep red Iowa. Donald Trump won this state by 13 points. Republicans control the governor's office, both chambers of the state legislature, and every congressional seat. On paper, this should be one of the strongest Republican fortresses in the country. But over the last 18 months, that fortress has started crumbling. One race, one district, and one humiliating defeat at a time.
The Iowa Senate is now back to its full strength after a special election on Tuesday filled the vacancy for Senate District 16, which oversees part of West Des Moines, Clive, and Windsor Heights. WHO 13's Teodor Mitov spoke with now Senator-elect Renee Hardman and has more.
Iowa State Senate District 16 elected a successor to late State Senator Claire Celsey, and voters made history doing so. Democrat Renee Hardman will now be the first black woman to serve in the Iowa State Senate after defeating Republican opponent Lucas Lofton in a special election held on Tuesday.
And the way this is unfolding has caught strategists in both parties completely off guard. Behind closed doors in Washington, officials are now asking a question they never imagined they would have to ask. If Republicans can no longer take Iowa for granted, then where exactly are they still safe? Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you will see exactly how one of the reddest states in America began unraveling piece by piece, right in front of everyone, and why Iowa may now be sending the clearest political warning of the entire 2026 cycle. To understand the stakes, you first have to understand what Iowa means in American politics. This is not just another state. What began as a few overlooked special elections in small legislative districts has grown into a political wave powerful enough to threaten the balance of power in November. And for Republicans, the most alarming part is simple. This story is still far from over.
Not being on that stage last week did help Rubio, gave him more talk time, for example, to make a closing argument. The conventional wisdom after the debate was that Trump had won by not being there. And we were all citing data from Twitter and Facebook showing Trump was the most talked about candidate. Well, being talked about is not always a good thing. There's news and then there's good news. That might have been bad news for Trump. Certainly, a lot of the talk was negative, and some people were motivated to vote against Trump. Some people, I think, we see the high turnout numbers on the GOP side. They were going to the caucuses particularly to vote against Trump. But I do think there's been an overreaction, an overcorrection in some of the coverage today.
Iowa is the state that helped launch Barack Obama toward the White House, then turned sharply toward Donald Trump, and moved even further to the right in 2024. Republicans did not simply win Iowa. They spent years transforming it into a political fortress, a model for how a Midwestern farming state could be locked down and kept permanently red. The GOP controlled nearly every statewide office, dominated both chambers of the legislature, and treated Iowa as some of the safest territory on the entire political map. This was supposed to be the last place where the Republican foundation would begin to crack, and that is exactly why the next development could not be dismissed as just another local election story. Washington noticed immediately. The first warning arrived in January 2025, though almost nobody outside the state paid attention. A state Senate seat became vacant, and Democrats managed to win a district that had backed Trump decisively only a few months earlier.
Trump has that great a voter machine. I think you've hit on the big difference. Ted Cruz is a product that fewer people like, looking at the surveys, but he had a better sales force, ground game. Donald Trump is a product that more people liked, but he didn't have the sales force. And I think in a small state, in a small caucus state, give Ted Cruz credit, he maximized what he could do. New Hampshire doesn't fit Ted Cruz that well. Organization is less significant than media in a state like New Hampshire.
At first, it looked like a total fluke, and honestly, I probably would have brushed it off too. Special elections are strange. Turnout is usually tiny, and sometimes one unusual district produces a result that means absolutely nothing beyond that single night. Republicans quickly dismissed it, and the national media barely gave it any attention. But inside Iowa, some of the people who understand the state's politics best started watching much more carefully. Because flipping a district that had just voted strongly for Trump, even in a small race with low turnout, is not something Democrats are supposed to pull off in a state Republicans considered completely secure.
Has its first open U.S. Senate seat in a dozen years, and Democrats have their eyes on this seat as a key race to flip. Local 5's Dana Searles is highlighting the Democratic primary candidates Josh Turek and Zach Walz and their key priorities and pitches for Iowans going into the midterm primaries.
Josh Turek is running his campaign on maintaining the American dream.
And that's through making sure we've got a livable wage, affordable housing, affordable health.
That was the first domino, but at the time, almost nobody understood how many more were already beginning to fall. Then March arrived, and Democrats came within striking distance of flipping a House district in southeast Iowa that Republicans had always treated as an automatic victory. They ultimately lost, but only by a razor-thin margin in a race that, according to the political map, should never have been remotely competitive. That result alone should have raised alarms. Then April came, and Democrats did not merely come close this time. They crossed the finish line and flipped an Iowa House seat outright. Suddenly, the Republican explanation that January had been nothing more than a strange, low-turnout accident was becoming much harder to sell. But August was the moment when this stopped looking like a collection of isolated surprises and started looking like an unmistakable political pattern. And pay close attention here, because the next seat was not located in some evenly divided suburban district where either party had a realistic chance. This was a state Senate seat centered around Sioux City, deep inside northwestern Iowa, one of the most reliably Republican regions in the entire state. This was the kind of district GOP officials believed they could hold without breaking a sweat. The vacancy was created after the Republican senator representing the district died, and nearly everyone assumed another Republican would simply step in and inherit the seat. That is not what happened. The Democratic candidate did not just pull off a narrow upset by a few dozen votes. She won decisively, securing a clear majority and defeating her Republican opponent in territory the GOP had considered untouchable. And this was not merely another embarrassing headline that party leaders could wait out for a few days. This result immediately changed the balance of power inside the Iowa Senate. It destroyed the Republican supermajority and pushed the party below the two-thirds threshold it had relied on to approve the governor's appointments without needing any cooperation from Democrats. That distinction matters. Republicans still controlled the chamber, but they had lost an important tool that allowed them to exercise power with almost no resistance. This was no longer a symbolic Democratic victory in an obscure local race. It was a direct, structural blow to the Republican governing machine in a part of Iowa where party leaders believed their dominance was permanent. And the Republican response told you they understood exactly how damaging it was. Party officials immediately went on the defensive, arguing that national Democratic organizations had flooded the district with outside money, campaign workers, and volunteers in order to manufacture one narrow special election victory. They wanted voters to believe this was not about Iowa changing. It was simply a heavily funded national operation overwhelming a small local campaign. Now, let me be fair. On the surface, that explanation was not completely ridiculous. Special elections can attract outside attention, national groups can spend heavily, and a concentrated burst of resources can absolutely affect a low turnout race. But that argument avoided the much bigger and far more uncomfortable reality. Democrats had now flipped 2 Republican-held seats in the same year, inside a state where Republicans had spent years insisting those kinds of losses were practically impossible. And Democrats were making sure everyone heard that message. National party leaders quickly pointed to the victory as evidence that voters were beginning to turn against the party in power. They described the result as a flashing warning sign for Republicans across the country. Normally, that kind of statement could be dismissed as predictable partisan spin, but this time, the actual election results were beginning to support it. My honest assessment is that this was the point when the Iowa story fundamentally changed. It was no longer a political curiosity or a handful of unrelated local races. It was becoming a real trend. Losing one unexpected district can be blamed on low turnout. Losing another can be blamed on a weak candidate. But when multiple Republican strongholds begin moving in the same direction within a matter of months, Press releases and television talking points are no longer enough to make the problem disappear. Then, just when Republicans believed the political shockwaves could not get any worse, two of the most powerful figures in Iowa politics delivered announcements that completely transformed the landscape. Governor Kim Reynolds, who had led the state for years and was widely expected to pursue another term, announced that she would not run again. The decision reportedly caught even members of her own party by surprise. Around the same period, longtime Republican Senator Joni Ernst confirmed that she would also step aside rather than seek another term, instantly creating one of the most consequential open Senate contests in the country. Think about the timing. Two of Iowa's most recognizable Republican leaders disappeared from the ballot during the same election cycle, just as their party was struggling to explain a string of humiliating legislative setbacks. Republicans were no longer simply defending several local seats. They were preparing for open battles over the governor's mansion, a United States Senate seat, and the future political identity of Iowa itself. And the situation surrounding Ernst made the problem even more politically toxic. Her final year in office had already become a public relations nightmare. During a town hall, a constituent confronted her about the potentially deadly effects of Medicaid cuts connected to Republican-backed legislation. Ernst responded with a remark that stunned the audience and spread across the internet almost immediately. She told the crowd, in effect, that everyone was eventually going to die. At exactly the moment Republicans needed to prove they understood the fears of working families, one of their most prominent senators had handed Democrats a devastating example of how disconnected the party could appear from the people affected by its policies.